Hi, everyone. My name is John Coughlin. I'm on the community relations team at GitLab. Our team's focused on growing and engaging the GitLab community, and we do that through a number of programs. One of them is the education program, which Christina, who put this meeting together today, manages. I manage a few programs focused on our evangelism efforts, which support folks in the GitLab community who want to increase advocacy and contribute in other ways. So that includes organizing GitLab meetups or making other contributions to GitLab, like doing tech talks, writing blog posts, producing videos, and other things that kind of help other GitLab members of the GitLab community learn how to use our platform. So I'm really excited to be a part of this kind of first meetup with the Last Mile community and welcome all of you into the GitLab community. One thing we do at the beginning of our meetups is talk a little bit about our code of conduct. At GitLab, one of our values is diversity, inclusion, and belonging, and we have a code of conduct that we use for all of our events. And kind of the gist of that is that we want to foster an open and welcoming environment and make sure that everybody, regardless of age, body size, disability, ethnicity, gender identity, and other kind of dimensions of diversity, feels welcome and inclusive and included. So please just try and stick to making sure this is a welcoming event for everyone. For today's meetup, we're going to be hearing from GitLab Senior Developer Evangelist, Brendan O'Leary. If you don't know what Brendan's job title means, I'd encourage you to ask him about that during the Q&A portion later. I'm sure he'd be happy to explain it to you. He's going to be walking us through an introduction to GitLab and DevOps. Normally, I would do an introduction to GitLab at the beginning of the meetup, but we actually have a special guest with us today, who I'm honored to introduce. GitLab's CEO and co-founder, Sid Sijbrandij, is here, and I think he's going to talk a little bit about how GitLab has grown into a 1,300-person company with over 3,000 code contributors. So I'd like to hand it over to Sid.
Thanks for that, John. Thanks for having me here. I'm going to talk a bit about how GitLab got started. So GitLab was made by my co-founder, Dmitry. Dmitry still lives in the Ukraine. And at that time, he had two things he wanted to improve in life. He didn't have running water in his house, and he didn't have great collaboration software at work. And he figured he'd solve the software problem first. So he made a collaboration tool so he and the members of his team could work better together. And he shared what he made with the rest of the world. And within a year, 300 people contributed back to GitLab. So they had the same need, they used it, and they saw room for improvement, so they contributed it back. It's only then, after a year, that I saw it, and it was very interesting. I thought, makes so much sense for this to be a collaborative project. I bet there's a business in it, and I started GitLab.com, offering it as a software as a service. And I sent him an email like, "Hey, I'm gonna try to make money with this, and you won't get any. I hope that's okay with you." And he sent an email back, "No, that's fine. It's open source. You can do whatever you want, and I'm glad you're making it more popular." Fast forward a year later, I wasn't making any money with GitLab.com, but I had a ton of companies who were running GitLab asking me to improve it, but I'm not a very gifted programmer, so I couldn't. And at the same time, Dmitry tweeted out to the whole world, "I want to work on GitLab full-time," because basically he was doing two jobs at the same time. So I emailed him like, "Hey, I got a lot of people asking for improvements. I think I can charge them for it. I'll pay you a fixed amount every month to do that." And we agreed on a deal, and I went to the local Western Union money office, and they said, "Do you know this person, or is this someone you met over the internet?" Because he was in the Ukraine, and in the Netherlands, they didn't have a very good reputation because there were lots of scams going on. But I made the wire, and we were in business, and we've since grown. We're now 1,300 people. The big growth happened when we came to the United States in 2015. We're 9 people all living in the same house for 3 months during Y Combinator. And over 100,000 organizations are using GitLab. And if you're not familiar with it, it's complete DevOps platform delivered as a single application. We help you get faster from what you want to build to getting it out there. And I reached out to the last mile, asking how we could help. And I was really delighted to hear that they were users of GitLab. I didn't know that in advance. So when Chris said that, I thought that was a great coincidence. And we look forward to not only talking, but also kind of implementing the features that you need to do your work better. Handing it back to John.
Thanks, Sid. Gabby, should I hand it over to Brendan, or is there anyone else that needs an introduction?
No, I think we can hand it over to Brendan.
All right, great. So Brendan, you want to kick off the talk?
Sure will. Thanks, John. Yeah, I'm just going to share my screen. And like John said, I'm going to do just a quick little introduction to GitLab and DevOps. I've tried to keep it really high level, but also, very specifically define the things I'm going to be talking about. Hopefully everybody can see my screen and give me a little thumbs up. I don't normally use Google Meet, so awesome. Thank you. One thing Sid didn't mention is our mission. Our mission statement is that everyone can contribute. We believe very strongly in the ability of community to contribute. We have over 3,000 code contributors to our open source project, even though we only have 1,300 people working for GitLab, the company. So that has shown us the power of community and the power of open source. As John said, my name is Brendan O'Leary. I'm a developer evangelist at GitLab. So I could talk a little bit about that now. I think it is relevant. It's kind of an interesting term. But basically my job is to go out and talk about how to use GitLab, how it can make your lives better with DevOps, and we'll talk a little bit about that today. And just generally, talk, I guess, preach. Like evangelism makes you want to come up with all these analogies, but basically, discuss how GitLab can be used better, and go out and live and be in those communities where folks are using it, so that I can better serve those communities and bring that feedback back into GitLab about how we can better serve those communities. So that's basically the job of developer evangelist. Another title you'll sometimes hear here is developer advocate. So very similar. Evangelist sounds a little bit more highfalutin maybe, but they're very similar roles. And so I kind of want to talk again today a little bit about DevOps, right? We heard Sid mention GitLab being a single application for the DevOps lifecycle. But there's a whole lot of words to define behind that, right? So I'm going to try and break it down to its most basic, and try to hopefully relate it to things you've been doing in class. But again, really looking forward to questions to help me understand where you all are at, so that I can kind of bridge that gap even more. So I kind of want to talk about, before we say what is DevOps, I think we need to understand what Dev and Ops are, because it's this kind of put together, made up word. We need to understand the parts of it first, and why they matter, and then why we decided to make a new word out of them instead of using the two. So first, I think it's clear to us that software is our present and definitely the future. This is a quote from a venture capitalist. His name is Mark Andreessen. It was about 10 years ago. He said this quote, that software is eating the world. And what he was saying there is that companies these days don't just want to be the best in their industries, but they have to be the best in software in their industry as well. Things are kind of one and the same. If we think about disruptions to markets over the past 10 or 20 years, you think of companies that brought technology to bear on what most would call a traditional market, right? So an Amazon changes the way people think about retail. Uber changes the way people think about transportation. And those are really extreme examples, right? They're the big companies, but this is happening throughout all of every industry you can name. And that's why I think it's such an awesome thing that you all are pursuing this as a possible career path or a learning path for yourself, because I think this is something that's not going anywhere anytime soon, and it's really the demand in the market for every business. And that's really great. I think you're already on your way there. But today, to get to kind of what DevOps is, I want to jump ahead and say, what does it look like once you kind of learn how to code, What are the buzzwords that people use like DevOps? And then what is it like to kind of, go and work on a team after that? So first I wanted to kind of start from like what we all know. I think almost everyone who's a professional or amateur software engineer, I know this is true of myself, started by just kind of playing around with their own code on their own computer. This is like a workflow that makes a lot of sense, right? We're on a computer, we build something, we run it, we see it in maybe our web browser or in the output of a terminal or something on our computer. That's kind of like a cycle that a lot of us are familiar with. And there's an interesting story here that I'm borrowing shamelessly from Kelsey Hightower, who's another developer evangelist, developer advocate, and probably one of the best known in the industry. I always say that he's who I'd love to be when I grow up. But he was giving a talk and talking about his young daughter and teaching her HTML and CSS. And she made a website, of course. It was like, fun. I can't remember what the details were, but I'm sure it was the website you'd expect from an 8 or 9 or 10-year-old. And she said, oh, I just want to send these to my friends. So can I just send them, this address that's in my bar, which is HTTP localhost :3000, right? The address to just her computer where the code was running. Well, of course, that like opens up this whole world that Kelsey is an expert in, but he's got to figure out how to kind of walk his daughter there, which is, well, no, you've got to deploy the code somewhere. You've got to have it, running publicly. It can't just be running on your computer if you want to share it with your friends. And so that kind of brings these kind of two challenges to bear. So if we go from just running our own code on our own computer that we look at to wanting to share what we're building with the world, there's kind of two major, there's lots of challenges there, but I've broken it down into two major challenges. One is we want to be able to collaborate on that code, like share the actual code with friends and colleagues, or maybe it's, like Dimitri in the story said, we want to make it open source so anybody can contribute to it. And then two, we need to run it somewhere, right? It needs to be running somewhere that's not just our laptop or our computer, but somewhere that everyone can see it. So when we talk about the first challenge, the number one thing you need is what's called source control, right? So this is where the Git in our name or GitHub's name comes from. Git is an open source control system. And what a source control system does is take, all of the files that we've made, if it's HTML, CSS, JavaScript files, all those files that may just be stored on a folder on our computer, we want to share that up to a repository where we can have everyone work on them at the same time and be able to merge that back together into one source. And an analogy that I think works pretty well here is it's like if you're working on a Microsoft Word document with a team versus working on a Google Doc. It's not exactly correct, but it's good enough. Right? If you have a Microsoft Word doc and you want to work on it with a team, you've got to share that. One person's editing at a time. You've got multiple copies of it everywhere. You've got to send it back and forth. You're going to have a conflict with each other when you come back together. You're going to have a long wait time for feedback because you might change something and not send it, or the other person might not see it for some time. The opposite of that, or kind of the antithesis of that, is a Google Doc, which lets you, see what everyone's doing, collaborate at the exact same time, helps eliminate conflicts. You still might have conflicts when people try to type over each other. Definitely happens to us sometimes if we're using there's a lot of people in a Google Doc. But it allows you to kind of work concurrently, right? And of course, again, you could share folders back and forth, but again, you're going to have that Microsoft Word document problem even then. And so that's really critical. And then this diagram we use kind of explodes all the other things that have to happen once you're working on a team. And so there's a lot going on in this diagram, and don't need to worry about too much of it. But once you have this concept of source control management, so a tool that understands what your source code is, understands if Brendan is changing these 3 files and John's changing these 3 files, and we're both changing the same file, how to merge all that together into one source. Once you have that, which is what Git provides, you can move things around much more efficiently. And it allows for like a much more complex kind of perfect world flow, right? So the basic idea of Git is I can, as a developer at the beginning of this, say there's an issue, something I want to change. I can create a branch, we call it a branch in Git, literally basically my own working copy where I can make all the changes I want, test them, see how they look, get review on them, have someone else look at them to see what they think. And then at a certain point in time, we can say, okay, we're going to merge this back into the main line or the main branch. And only when we do that, do my changes then impact everyone else. Right? So in a large development team, there's lots of these branches going on, and people bringing them, branching off of the main branch and then coming back together with the changes. And of course, again, if you're trying to do that manually, that's a hard thing to keep track of. So that's where a source code management tool like GitLab comes in. And then the second challenge, right, that comes after that, like once we've gotten everybody's changes into that main branch, the challenge is, okay, how do we send this to the customer, right? How do we get this out to the people that I want to see it? How do I share my website with my friends, right? And sometimes in some companies, send to the customer could be that literally, right? Maybe I burn a CD or a DVD and send it to the customer. That's obviously not the way most companies do it these days, right? Most companies run what's called software as a service, or you hear SaaS, right? And so that's a website or an app that runs on computers somewhere on the internet and can be accessed by anyone. And, back in the day, which wasn't that long ago, it's still true at some companies, there were kind of two different concerns when it came to doing this. There were the developers, who we saw in the last step, who were making the changes to the code in their branches and merging them back in the main line. And there were operators, people that were in charge of keeping the computers kind of fed and watered and running, that were running the service. They were kind of just like that customer that the developers shipped their code to, right? They threw a CD over this wall here to their operators and said, oh, here, have fun. Good luck running the software. And that caused a lot of tension because developers want to move really fast, and I'm sure you've experienced it yourself. Once you get on a roll, you're changing something, you're really excited to share it with everyone. Whereas, an operator of a system is like, their responsibility is for the stability of that system, right? If you think about, major SaaS providers, right, like a Netflix or an Amazon, right, those folks are really focused on making sure that they're always up and they're always running. And so that's what an operator is really concerned about, is how secure and stable is my service. And really, neither of those extreme kind of viewpoints are workable today. It's not what how people expect software to be delivered to them today. Right? It's like trying to rent out DVDs out of a storefront just a little bit better while you've got Netflix over here, delivering video to people on demand, right? You can't just make that just a little bit better. You actually have to change the way you do business together. And so that's when the industry invented this term DevOps, right? And it's an intentionally kind of a confusing word that brings together two other words, because it's meant that all of this is supposed to happen kind of in one loop, right? It's all one job: getting the code changed to what the customer wants, to getting it live on the site so they can see it, or in the app so they can see it, to getting feedback from them on what they want next, right? That whole thing is a cycle, like we see here, not really just like a step-by-step incremental process, right? It's not like building a building where you build first the foundation and then this, and then you build on top of it, and then you put the furnishing inside. It's a lot more of a continuous loop than that. But of course, this is a concept that's a lot easier to talk about than it is to implement. This is a slide we kind of show in our marketing material, but I think it helps you kind of understand how complex this gets in reality. It's, and it's what it is typically developers like to develop software to solve problems. So they end up writing a lot of software. And so you'll hear about a lot of different tools that try to help to solve all these problems about how do we work together and get stuff shipped to our customers. But I would say that as you're learning these things, right, you'll learn about GitLab, you'll learn about maybe some other stuff in here like Jenkins or Jira or Docker, right? There's all kinds of things to learn about. But I would say the important thing is to try not to get too focused on one correct path, right? Everybody's going to choose their own path. And of course, GitLab's marketing would be that answer to that's GitLab. And I see Sid still on the call, so I should probably say it's GitLab, but it's not just GitLab, right? It's finding the thing that works correctly for you, and just know there's challenges at every part. And there's people that have different needs once you start working on a team to deliver software, right? And different motivations, right? If you work with a team to deliver software, there's going to be someone who's in charge of security, and their motivation is going to be to make it as secure as possible. Whereas your motivation, again, this is speaking from personal experience, you're really excited about a new thing you made and you want to get it out to everyone to see it. And so this is kind of where GitLab comes in, and that's why I wanted to show that, because this is what GitLab tries to be. So in some ways, GitLab's another one of those tools that we see. It can do a lot of those different things. But the reason we like it so much, I used GitLab before I came to GitLab, is we want to make like it much simpler for all of the people that are needed, right? I said there's security people, there's developers, there's operators. We want to make it much simpler for all those people to come kind of collaborate and work together. And we've become a really popular tool doing that. So again, Sid went through some of these details before, but one of the really exciting things is our open source model, right? It's not just about how big we've grown the company, although that's very big. I joined when we were about 200 people, and now we're 1,300. But we also have 3,000 people that have contributed code directly back to GitLab. And I know one of the future sessions that Christina has planned is going to talk more about that. And we also have 10,000 total contributors. So we also have an open issue tracker, so people can report issues to us, even if they don't know how to code, which is really helpful. And then there's lots of businesses that trust us. So you're using a tool and learning to use a tool that people know about. Many businesses across any industry you can name is going to have GitLabs. I always say they're going to have GitLab somewhere. The question is, have we gotten them to be the one solution is GitLab, or is it still running under someone's desk because somebody likes GitLab and they used it before and they're running it under their desk? But you'll find GitLab basically everywhere. And I think a lot of that success comes from our values. That's one thing I wanted to talk about here. They're really important, right? John talked about our code of conduct, which is informed by these, of course. But the other reason I wanted to bring this up is, these are values that aren't that far off from what you'll find in many open source projects, right? These things that we care about at GitLab are things that open source projects need, right? They have to be able to collaborate, right, and work asynchronously with each other. They have to be efficient as possible, right? They don't want to take a long time making a change. Excuse me, but we also take them very seriously as a company and discuss them all the time. And I think it has directly impacted our ability to succeed, right? So things like iteration and the minimal viable change. It's like, can we make a change that makes our customers' lives just a little bit better? If we can, the answer is to make that change and ship it rather than waiting to have a whole bunch of changes together to ship. And then, of course, transparency. So we talked about it a little bit, but everything at GitLab is public by default. So our entire corporate strategy, how Sid thinks about that and the board thinks about that, our roadmap for the product, the goals that we set quarterly. You could go find the quarterly goals for me if you dug far enough into our website, or for Christina, and our handbook. So something I spent a lot of time reading because I had some free time was our handbook before I joined. And I would encourage you to take a look at that if you can, because it's got a lot of information about how we really run the company. And so that transparency really helps us build that community as well. And then just lastly, so again, this is just very much a marketing slide, but it shows kind of the 10 stages of DevOps. We saw that circle earlier, and now they're in a straight line again, which is a little antithetical, but that's okay. But this shows all the different things and pieces that can come into, that are part of GitLab that feed into the DevOps lifecycle. So obviously, developing code, learning the code, that's the most important thing you can do. But it's also important to be thinking about, when I work on a team, if I'm working on an open source project, or if I am working in a career in software engineering, I'm gonna have to be thinking about security. I'm gonna have to be thinking about how does verification work? How does the build process work for building the final product? But there's a lot of other pieces that come into it, and we're not gonna dive in all of those. But I did wanna kind of just give one quick overview of GitLab, and then I see there's a bunch of questions And so I want to leave some time for those shortly. So I took this screenshot of GitLab, which is brand new because we just had this dark mode added to GitLab. But this is just one project in GitLab. So in GitLab, you can have multiple projects. And a project is kind of a set of code together. And so this project happens to be the GitLab project. It's kind of very meta, but we use GitLab to build GitLab. So this is actually the source code for GitLab stored within GitLab.com. And I always talk about how that left-hand column that you'll see when you're in GitLab shows you a lot of that story that we talked about of what are the stages of the DevOps lifecycle, right? The repository gives me access to my source code and tags and all the things that are relevant to the Git part of GitLab. Issues show me, what are the things we want to do, right? We've got a low 30,000 open issues on the GitLab project of things we'd like to do about it. You'll probably have a few less than that on a project you're working on, but that's where you can kind of store all of your ideas for, hey, where are we going next with this project? Merge requests are kind of at the end of that little developer pipeline we saw, right? When I want to merge my code back into the main branch, I can do that with a merge request, and I can have it reviewed by a colleague or a peer. Requirements helps me manage like the business requirements. What are the requirements that are going to make the stakeholders of the business say that yes, we've got it working. CI/CD is all of the building and deploying of the software. So CI is continuous integration. That means as we're putting that code back together, continuously try to build it and run all the tests that we can against it to make sure we haven't broken anything. And CD is continuous delivery or continuous deployment. Once we've got it tested, let's ship it, right? How do we ship that out to our customers? Security and compliance, of course, this covers security, which we could spend a whole session on, but application security is obviously something that's very important. And so we've got some tools built in for that. Operations shows us all the things about how is the application in the production system. Is it running well? Are people getting errors? What are those kinds of things? And then there's a couple other things here. Packages talks about if we're packaging up our software to send it to someone, that's where that would be. Analytics shows us details on, okay, given that whole life cycle, how long are things taking? Snippets are just little pieces of code that might help, and members shows us who's a part of this project. So again, that's just a quick, 5-second overview of the UI, but I think I wanted to end on this to kind of connect it back to, this kind of theory of DevOps, right? You'll see that kind of implemented in practice when you get in or when you are in GitLab. I think that's all I wanted to talk through. So Gabby, I know we've got a lot of questions coming in, which is awesome.
Yeah, we do. We have a lot of questions.
Stop
so
presenting
yeah, thank you.
Answer those. Yeah. Great.
Yeah. Okay, awesome. Yeah, so we do have a lot of questions. I posted them in the chat for folks to view, but I'll also read them out loud. So the first questions are regarding remote work. What is an all-remote company? What are some of the problems that you encounter with an all-remote company, and what are some of the benefits?
Sure, I can talk a little bit. Sid, do you want to talk about that? You've got a lot of opinions. Go for it.
So yeah, GitLab is an all-remote company. That means that we don't have co-located facilities. Like people work from home or sometimes from an office, but there's no offices where a certain department sits. In fact, most people opt to work from home. We have people in 65 countries because we're not restrained to certain locations. And we believe we're the biggest all-remote company today. And I think that a lot of companies have discovered that they can totally do their productivity remote. Due to COVID, a lot of companies had to go remote, and with Zoom, with tools like Zoom and Slack and Microsoft Teams and Google Docs, that is relatively easy. Our big lesson is that you need to organize the informal communication. Otherwise, you'd be at the office, you'd hang around the water cooler, things like that. You don't have that anymore, so you need to organize it. We have a whole page of tactics on how to do that. But an example is if you join GitLab, you get 10 coffee chats where you just chat for 25 minutes with someone. And after that, every week, you're reminded to keep doing that with someone.
Okay, awesome. Thank you. Next question from the students. what were the biggest struggles you had on your way to success, and what roadblocks did you face?
In the beginning, there was skepticism. I remember the first talk I gave, I wore lab coat and safety goggles because GitLab, like laboratory. And not only did I look ridiculous, people thought the idea was ridiculous because we had an incumbent competitor called GitHub, who already, like every person in the room was already using GitHub. So they didn't see the need for a second entrance. I think another tough thing was figuring out our pricing model. We used to charge, for example, for support, but we made the product so good that people didn't need support, and then they canceled their subscriptions, leaving us without any money. So that took a while to figure out. We settled on what we now call buyer-based open core, where people pay for features. Another pivotal moment was when we raised our B round of financing. That's kind of raised 20 million or something, and there was a lot of skepticism about us being all remote and that being able to scale. Brendan?
Yeah, that's great. I was going to say, I was going to try and share like a personal struggle. I don't know, Sid, if you have any you can think of while I'm sharing.
Go for it.
Yeah, like just personally, I think it can be isolating to work as a software engineer, right? You can be kind of focused on a problem that is between you and the computer, and and you feel like you're kind of on an island on your own, and you might be the only person that's ever had this problem because you don't understand something. And I think the best, I mean, it's not an easy way to overcome that, other than you have to know that, you know, basically everyone has had that problem before, or if they haven't, it's not because you're not able to figure something out, it's because you found something new and novel. So I think kind of getting over myself and like understanding that when I hit a roadblock, it's so that I can learn something. It's not that I have to, it's not that it means I should give up. It can be really tough with programming, right? There's times where you're trying to get something to work for a whole day, and you feel like you've wasted your whole day, and then you find out it was a semicolon or something simple, or you find the right answer on a Google search. And so it can be tough to keep going, and then it makes you skeptical, right? Sid talked about skepticism. You get skeptical about yourself. And so I think that's probably been my biggest challenge, is getting over that.
Great, thank you. Biggest challenge growing GitLab, I think, Sid, you answered that. The next question is this what you thought you'd be doing when you were younger?
I had a couple of companies I started, so I did see myself as an entrepreneur, but I didn't think one would be so successful because the other ones weren't so successful. So it is a bit of a dream come true to kind of come to the US and get a company to over $1 billion of valuation. I think that one of the things that served me well in life is follow my curiosity. Every time I follow that, I end up in really interesting places. So I think it's, although like sometimes it's super helpful to kind of follow a course and learn to code, but also sometimes it's okay you're interested in something and follow that. And it's super helpful if it's something that fewer people are interested in and that has more kind of potential usefulness. Like if you're super into movies, that's cool, and it helps you relate to other people, but it's unlikely to pay off. But if you're into movie editing now with all the YouTube stars, that's a bigger potential for payoff there.
All right, next question is, how did you teach yourself how to code?
I'll take it first, and then Brendan. I was at a company which was building submarines at the time, and it was 5 years in. It wasn't growing very fast anymore. It's good because they still build the most submarines. U-Boat Works in the Netherlands. And I saw this programming language called Ruby, and I was always interested in programming, but I thought it was too tedious. I looked at Java code and it looked boring, and I read some of the Ruby source code. I was like, this reads like poetry. This is beautiful. So then I started programming, and then I had to get a job, but I'm afraid to interview because it's very hard on your psyche. So I didn't want to interview. So I figured I'd become a contractor, and then I put down a very low hourly rate because I had zero experience and I wasn't very good. I think it was $15 or $20 an hour or something. And then as I programmed, I got better, and I continued to raise my price. Your early customers don't totally appreciate that if your price rises by a factor of 3 in 2 years, but it did reflect like how I was getting better and more proficient at being a programmer. And I learned to code in Ruby mainly through a book. It's called the Skateboard Book, but it's the agile programming in Ruby on Rails. And I think I read that 3 times. The first time I understood less than half, and the second time a bit more than half, and the last time I understand everything in the book.
Yeah, it's a great question. I am even more classically self-taught. I did not even read a book. I came up in an era where there was this website called GeoCities, which some people may remember. They're of the right age. But basically, it was like you could publish your own website, right? And then there were people that would like share snippets of JavaScript code that would do cool things, like, oh, I want like a page counter or something, right? And so you would end up like copying and pasting these things and not understanding what they do at all, and then just breaking things because they didn't, they weren't compatible with each other. So I mostly learned through doing and breaking things. But the more important thing than that though is I wasn't super afraid to break them, for better or for worse. I broke the first computer my dad ever let me play with, and he wasn't very happy with me. But the other really important thing I always say is you have to have something you want to do. I think it's really critical to have a problem you want to solve. So people will ask me, my dad's an accountant, he's really great at Excel. I said, well, how did you get really good at Excel? So, well, I had a problem I had to solve and I figured it out, right? It's not necessarily a book. Or I've got a friend who's a graphic artist. Well, how did you get really good at Photoshop? It's like, well, I had a picture I wanted to change and I wanted it to look like this and I figured it out. That's honestly maybe not the best way, but it is a critical part to learning to code, I think, which is like having a problem you want to solve. Really gives you the motivation to keep going and learn, and that's how I always do
it. Great, thanks. Next question is, what trends do you see coming in web development, and how can our students best prepare for that?
It's a good question. I would say that Sid probably has a longer view of the market than I do, but I think JavaScript is clearly going to be with us for a long time. So I think learning that is going to be really valuable. I think that we've also seen that JavaScript frameworks. So when I say frameworks, I mean things like you've heard of maybe React or Vue.js or Elixir, or there's a number of other frameworks. Svelte. I think those are great and great to learn, but I would encourage you to learn as much kind of pure or vanilla JavaScript, you'll hear people say, as you possibly can, because I think understanding kind of that at a basic level then really helps you when you hit a hard problem. I know there's other newer things coming in web development, but I think that starting with the basics of JavaScript are going to do you really well, because it's going to be with us for some time. Sid, any other thoughts?
I think that's spot on. That's exactly right. I had a week off 2 weeks ago, and we reversed roles. I taught my now wife how to code, and now she taught me how to code, because I knew how to code in Ruby on Rails. And during the holiday, I worked for a few hours on a very simple game, and it was built in React on JavaScript. So written in JavaScript. I think that's the most popular thing you could learn right now.
Okay, next questions are regarding open source projects. How do you start an open source project on GitLab? And another related question was, is it possible to share an open source project with a select number of individuals?
It's a good question. So to start an open source source project with GitLab is pretty simple, right? You can sign up for a GitLab.com account, and you can, create a group for that project and get started, right? So if you have your project set as public, you get all of the open source benefits of GitLab. Although even if you want to keep it private, you can still use GitLab.com. That's what actually brought me to GitLab.com from GitHub at first. Sid mentioned earlier, everybody's using GitHub, and people said, "Why do you need GitLab?" Well, I needed it to keep some code that I wanted to have private, stay private. And so GitLab being open source, and then, so I'm just reading this question again. What if I'm working on a new app, but I want the project idea to not be commandeered? Yeah, so can you open source it? You can. It's hard to open source it to a select number of people, but you can open a project only to a select number of people, right? So traditionally, open source means, although there are various definitions, that anyone can take it and use it, right? So Dimitri and Sid, right? He told that story earlier. Sid said, "Hey, I'm going to go make money off GitLab," and Dimitri had to say, "That's cool," right? Now, it worked out for Dimitri in the end, and it worked out for Sid in the end, but that's not always true. So if you have something that you want to build and you're not sure if you want to open source it, you can start by keeping it closed source and make it private on GitLab, and you can then share that project just with a few folks. So like I have a side project that I made before I came to GitLab. That's an app, and it's on GitLab.com, and it's just shared with me and a buddy of mine who can program on it. So it's not open source, it's closed source, and then just him and I work on it. Now, you can also then get really complicated. There are different kinds of open source. So there are some companies who open source their code, but do it in a legal way where people can't technically legally take their code and make money off of it. So there's different nuances to licenses, but that's probably not what you need to worry about right now. If you want to keep it closed for now, keep it closed for now. You can always decide to open source it later. Or if you want to try and open source it and get more people to help you with it, then open source it from the beginning.
Yeah, if you know people that want to help you, for sure, just share it with them. And you can still make it open source. You can change, that's basically the license you apply. So even if you only invite a select number of people to look at it, you can still have it under an open source license. I think that one thing I learned coming to Silicon Valley is that people are very unlikely to steal your idea. It happens, and I've heard some horror stories. But most companies fail not because someone steals their idea, but because nobody cares about their idea. So most of the time, your biggest problem is telling people. So on average, you should optimize to telling more people about your idea rather than fewer.
Can I just add to the open source, like getting involved with open source? I think one thing that I would recommend, rather than thinking about open sourcing your own projects, would be finding projects that you're interested in and contributing to those projects. By doing that, you'll be able to get involved in a community more quickly because there will already be a community developed around those projects. And you'll be able to learn from other folks in the community. Chances are there'll be, documentation and, forums and things that you can participate in and learn from. And so I think, that can be a great first step if you're interested in open source and looking for ways to get involved. Obviously, I'm biased. I'm on the community team at GitLab, so I think that we do a great job. And we have a lot of folks who get started in our community by contributing translations or documentation, not necessarily even code, to get started. But yeah, I think any kind of community that you're, using as part of your curriculum, or I should say any project that you're using as part of your curriculum, like look at those communities, see how they communicate with each other, see, where you feel comfortable and get started there. And that'll be a great kind of learning experience for you as you move into that next phase of open sourcing your own projects.
Yeah, and I would just double recommend that by also saying, again, don't feel, I think it's really intimidating sometimes to look at a well-run, quote unquote, open source project and think about contributing, right? Like, so I use Vue.js, right? That's a project actually that GitLab uses. And if I were to go look at that code base today, I'd be really intimidated right away. But I would say that every open source project has a huge desire to have people contribute, right? So if it's, I did this documentation and it was confusing and I think it should be written like this because now I sat here for a couple hours and figured it out and this would make way more sense to me. I would say vast majority of open source companies are going to projects are going to really invite that kind of contribution. And I think it's easy to, in a group of software engineers, get around and kind of discount documentation, but it's really important, and it's really important in open source. And so don't discount your ability to do that. Like, I went to do something new in GitLab today I hadn't done before, and the documentation was just out of order. And I just contributed a thing to flip it, right? Because it made more sense to go in the other order. Two steps needed to be flipped. But that could really help the next person that goes to use it. So that's critical.
Thanks, Brendan and John. I think those are great points. I just wanted to add something that Gabby and I were chatting about, is that contributing to an open source project while you're in school and while you're learning is a great way to build up your portfolio and your resume. So don't think that just because it's not an employed position that it doesn't contribute to who you are and what your skills are. Especially if you're doing it on a platform like GitLab, you can show in your profile how many contributions you've made and to what projects you've made them. And then that way, when you do go on the job market, you have that track record of what you've contributed to and what skills you've demonstrated and kind of how you've grown as an individual before you're actually out in the market. So that's something that Gabby and I want to continue to develop on with our relationship.
Yeah, definitely. Okay, next question from our students. What are some of the biggest tips or tricks you all have for interviewing in the tech industry, or even specifically at GitLab?
I think, like, I'm always super impressed. Like, I don't do the technical engineering interviews anymore, and contributing to open source is not a requirement at all. But I'm always very impressed when I see a candidate that has contributed to open source, and I look at their GitHub or GitLab profile, and then I see whether the contributions they made, whether they were accepted. And then most of the time, I don't even look at the code. I just look at how they name their changes. Are they careful about how they present what they do? Because communication is like the most important thing when you have big software projects. It's no longer the code, it's the communication.
Yeah, I would add that communication is key. And I think another key is just, I think it's really important in tech and oftentimes overlooked, that it's important to say that you don't know when you don't know something. So I would say that the big interview tip I would have is, like, don't try to make something up if you don't know. Say you don't know, right? I say that all the time.
Say you don't know, and say how you would figure it out. I don't know, and my first step would be Stack Overflow, and my second step would be that, and my third step would be asking my friend who's a specialist in this.
Exactly. Yeah. I think that companies should look for problem solvers that know how to solve problems more than have memorized some, specific class definition or exactly how a bubble sort works, or, a lot of these things you'll read about on tech interviews on the internet. I mean, not that those questions don't exist. I would just say, if you're honest and talk through, the thing I always look for in technical interviews is how people solve problems, not if they can know something that they memorized.
I think that's from the perspective of GitLab. I think from the perspective of the applicant, figure out what the interview process is at that company. And if they do have these standard questions they ask, just make sure you're trained on them, because you're going to have a huge leg up. If they're going to ask you what FizzBuzz is and you already know, that's going to just go so much smoother. So while we might disagree whether that's a good tactic in interviewing, it's not about that. It's about getting the job. So figure out what that process is. And many companies will actually tell you some of it. And sometimes you can find stuff online, or try to see if you know someone in the company.
Yeah, I would say like Glassdoor or other websites, oftentimes, if it's a big enough company, are going to have a lot of details about their interview process. If it's a transparent company like GitLab, we have our interview process outlined very clearly. But even if they're not, I would say doing your research on them, you'll be able to find people that say, oh, these are the kind of questions I got in the technical interview with whichever company it is.
And maybe one last thing, some companies have are more challenged hiring people. Like at GitLab would be probably a pretty hard place to get in. The more boring companies that are not focused on software per se, so they're making shoes or cornflakes or something like that, and they still have software vacancies, they have a super hard time hiring. So if you're at the start of your career, it might be beneficial to get your foot in the door there. And then after 2.5, 3 years, move over to a company that's specialized in software, because you're going to learn a ton while you're there and you have colleagues.
Yeah, it's a really good point, Sid. I tried to emphasize that point earlier, right? When I said every company needs good software people, right? And so that means don't limit your search to just companies in Silicon Valley, right? I live on the East Coast of the US, nowhere near San Francisco. I'm lucky enough to work for a company that's all remote, that happens to also be a Silicon Valley kind of based company. But if it wasn't, I've worked for years beforehand in local companies near me that needed software people. And so that's really helpful. And to Sid's other point, that first job is really critical, right? Get that first job and take it for what you're going to learn from it, and then learn what you can. And if it's not the right fit, then you can move on in a couple of years. That's okay.
Thank you. Yeah, that was all very good info. I know our students are always talking about interview tips. Next question is, does GitLab hire people who are formerly incarcerated?
We do, but we do have a background check. And actually, I've not seen a ton of cases. So there's no blanket no. There's not a blanket yes either. It depends on kind of what role we're hiring for and what your record is. But unfortunately, there's been very few, and in my opinion, too few people even getting to the end of the process there. So I think that's a top of funnel problem. And yeah, what your record is and what you're incarcerated for whether that's relevant to the job, determines whether we can make the hire or not.
Great. Next question for Brendan. What kind of work did you do in healthcare institutions, environmental services, and in the Department of Defense?
Sure. Yeah, I can talk about that. I listed because, again, I've worked for a lot of different companies, but almost always in software. So I'm going to go in order of my career. So environmental services was first. I worked for it's not as interesting as submarines, but it's kind of interesting. The environmental services firm. They're an engineering firm that made, if you've ever seen like an ionic breeze, it's like the little fan you can get that has plates in it that like blows air through and like cleans your air. They basically made that, but at the scale of the air coming out of a power plant or the air coming out of a paper mill. So it was a massive building, but at its core, it's basically an ionic breeze. Like charged particles coming in and then got them to stick to plates and then go down instead of going into the atmosphere. And so I worked in IT for them for a number of years. So I learned a lot there. Then I worked for 10 years, actually in a radiology software company. So healthcare is full of software needs. Our company specialized really specifically in women's imaging software. So I learned more about cancer and breast cancer than I ever thought I'd learn in my life because, yes, the software is important, but it was also really important that I understood the industry we were in. And I spent 10 years there. It's a much smaller company, right? Not a venture-backed startup like GitLab. It was kind of just a single owner who had never taken on debt. And so we grew it felt really fast at the time, but it was really controlled compared to coming to GitLab. And then I worked, so I live, as I mentioned, on the East Coast and near DC, and basically everyone who lives near DC ends up at some point contracting the government in some way. So I was a contractor to the Department of Defense for the US SOCOM, Special Operations Command, intelligence division and software that they used there. So that was obviously really interesting, very different kind of customer on the other end. Like, again, both healthcare and the DoD were very important and kind of life critical customers on the other end. And I learned a lot about how in a really large institution like the US federal government, software delivery differs from a much smaller group. And then and that's where I was a GitLab user at that company. And that's when I came to GitLab was from there.
Awesome, thank you. So we are coming to the end of our time. I wanted to give you all an opportunity if you had any parting words for our students before we get off the call. But yeah, thank you all so much for answering all those questions and for taking the time today to speak to our students.
Thanks, and I admire people who are learning how to code. It's not easy. It's super tough, but I've seen a lot of people who were able to double or triple or grow their income even more. So it might be worth it.
I want to say thanks again for everyone too. Really appreciate it, Sid and team. Thank you so much.
Thanks for the questions. Yeah. We appreciate it.
Yeah, it was great. Thanks so much.
Thanks for having us.
Okay, thanks everyone. Have a great rest of your day.